Welcome to the first and only film screening that's part of the lecture series this fall. I'd like to remind you about the Peter Eisenman lecture on Friday, 4:30 on Friday, and even though we have no classes that day, it's going to be an important lecture, and it's important that we have a good turnout, so I invite you to return on Friday at 4:30. Welcome to, as I said, the first and only film screening of the fall semester. Today we have a special guest with us, Betty Cohen from Los Angeles, who directed this film, directed, produced, edited, and basically an auteur on this film, which is titled The Spirit in Architecture, John Lautner. We also have Steve and Jacob, her husband and son, are with us in the audience today, so I'd like to welcome them. Betty Jane Cohen is an award-winning filmmaker and film editor. She produced, wrote, and directed today's film, which portrays the life and work of the Los Angeles architect John Lautner. She's also currently working on another film, which is titled In Search of a Living Architecture. It's a film about the architect Albert Frey. Her education includes time at UCLA and the Southern California Institute of Architecture. She has created arts and cultural programs for Kunstkanaal in the Netherlands, and her work has screened at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, the Pompidou Center in Paris, the House of Architecture in Moscow, Harvard, Pratt, and the Graham Foundation in Chicago. She's the recipient of a Cine Golden Eagle Award, as well as grants from the Graham Foundation, the American Architectural Foundation, and the City of Los Angeles Cultural Affairs Program. Betty has been a film editor on feature films and television productions such as The Lady in White, Mother, The Sleeping Car, and Creature. She has also edited various documentaries and commercials, and she has worked as editor, assistant editor, visual FX, and photographer for many directors you know, including James Cameron, Steven Spielberg, John Cassavetes, Richard Donner, Elaine May, and many others. I personally met Betty about 3 years ago during the course of my research on John Lautner. And she's been incredibly generous in sharing her wealth of materials that she collected during the production of her film in the late 80s. It's an incredible archive, actually, for architectural historians and architectural theorists, especially the interviews she was able to conduct with the late John Lautner, the late Philip Johnson, as well as the late architectural historians, including David Gephardt, Esther McCoy, and Bruno Zebi. So it's a really great treasure trove of material. I'd encourage you, over the course of this, as it's about an hour-long film, to pay close attention to the way the film frames an architecture which is already fascinated with framing. So Lautner's work, although the forms you're going to see are quite bulbous and curvaceous and what we think of as animate form, a la Greg Lynn, Frank Gehry, and so on. The preoccupation of Lautner himself was more about animation of the view from the buildings, okay? Also about the animation, the actual animation of automation technologies that he incorporated into the buildings themselves. So it had less to do with a kind of movement simulation, or let's say a kind of static snapshot of movement, a la Gehry and Lynn, etc., and had more to do with actual movement. Okay, so the way Betty uses time-lapse in particular and panning cinematographic techniques, a really important way of disclosing the architecture itself. So don't just look at the architecture, but look at the way the architecture itself is framed. So before we begin the film, Betty will say a little bit about the production itself, and she's agreed to field questions from the audience on the conclusion of the film. So I hope you'll ask some provocative questions because she has some really interesting stuff to tell us. So help me welcome Betty Jane Cohen.
Hello. It's my pleasure to be here. Everybody hear me okay? So I made this film on John Lautner. It examines his life and work. And John is part of a century-long chain of American individualists. His work represents an aspect of organic design, the legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright, and contributions of Southern California architecture that expands our understanding and the nature of modernism. I started working on this film in 1988 while studying architecture at Southern California Institute of Architecture. The film premiered in 1991 at MoCA, celebrating John Lautner's 80th birthday. John and I screened the film together at Taliesin West in Phoenix, Vancouver, BC with a traveling exhibition, Vienna, Austria with an exhibition of Lautner's work organized by students of Hans Hollein, Northern University in Marquette, Michigan, Lautner's hometown, and Harvard in Cambridge. It's been almost 13 years since John's death and 16 years since I finished the film. As time passes, John's work becomes more and more important and mainstream. Lautner's the subject of scholarly attention. Scholars, critics, and historians have had the time to put John Lautner's life into perspective. This film and my research materials, not included in the film, have formed part of the background for many scholarly works and exhibitions. It appears virtually in all bibliographer notes as a major resource. In July 2008, there will be a major John Lautner exhibition at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Museum of Art has acquired the Goldstein office, which will be installed at LACMA West as Michael Govan, the museum director's office. The J. Paul Getty Trust has acquired the Lautner archives, and they've begun work on its preservation. The archives are now being fumigated, and then the Getty will begin to catalog all of the materials. I first had a background in photography and filmmaking. I was a film editor in various documentaries, as John told you, but I became more and more interested in architecture. And I was telling a friend of mine what I was interested in architecture, and he said, well, have you seen the work of John Lautner? So I started to research John's houses, and I stumbled upon a Los Angeles Conservancy tour and got a chance to walk into several of the buildings. And the owner who invited me on the tour, he said, well, you seem so interested in John Lautner, you should just go into his office. And so I did, and I didn't meet him at the time, but I got a bibliography of different things that were written, and I came across an oral history at UCLA, and I listened to the quarter-inch tapes. And it was during that time that I thought that a film would be a really great way to show these buildings. Since no book had existed and no film had existed. And so I started to research it, and I started to write a grant for the NEA. And then I told a friend of mine about the project, and he looked at me and he goes, what, are you crazy? You're writing a grant and you're making a film about somebody that you've never met and you don't even have permission. So I called him up and told him about the project, and he said to me, well, I had never made a film before, but I just felt very strongly about doing this. And he says, well, it seems like a worthwhile project, and you seem tall enough to do it. So he gave me the permission, and I started to work on it. I started working with a co-producer, Evelyn Wendell, and Bernard Zaltzman was our first cinematographer. I worked with him, and at the time I was looking for a director, and Bernard said to me, well, why don't you just direct it? And so I did. I couldn't find anybody who would do it. And it's such a big sort of responsibility, I always envisioned it to produce it. I just knew it needed to be done. But I ended up directing it, and so while developing the project, I interviewed several critics and historians, as John told you. A lot has changed technically since I made the film, and one of the biggest changes is digital technology. I shot this film in 16mm and 35mm. The interviews were recorded on quarter-inch tape and cassette, which were transferred to 16mm, and I edited the film on a 16mm Steelbook. Today, I edit my material on a computer and I shoot digitally. These rare interviews are part of my archive on John Lautner, and I'm now digitizing and preserving all the interviews. I'm planning on including additional material on the re-release of the DVD. So it's my pleasure to be here, and I hope you enjoy the film.
changed for 3,000 or 4,000 years. I considered that when I first started. I thought about the cliff dwellers and the nomads and what people really are, you know, psychologically and every other way. They want to be free, but they want a little shelter. And you don't have to have velvet cushions. When I first came here, there were architectural students asking me, you know, how I like Los Angeles and what would I do. And I said, what I do is go up on Mulholland here and make giant concrete balls and roll them down the hills. That would get rid of Hollywood and Vine and all of the junk that's here, and then you could do something. My main feeling and purpose really is, since I'm involved with man-made environment, is to create the most desirable environment to improve human life, no matter what the purpose, whether it's a house or a factory or a restaurant. It's not designing to suit bankers or building codes or contractors, it's designing for people. One of the most important things in all architecture is timeless, enduring space.
The message of architecture is one of the most fascinating in the world because you can't escape. You are in the message. You are not receiving the message, but you are inside the message. The Christian architecture is the one that produces messages that just you. Where? In the mind, in the heart, in all your body, because space envelopes you. Space is behind you, so side, left side, front.
Modernism, I think, is probably sort of an extreme, in an extreme way, completely idiosyncratic. It has to do with his view of the world and how the world should be ordered. Seem to find a source inside of him, and I think that's probably why his work was more compelling to me as a youngster. Not knowing very much about architecture intuitively, I felt compelled to continually climb up the hill to see this house with my friends. The reason his work, I think, is so powerful and so overwhelming is because he has the strength of character and the courage to produce things in ways that no one else has the courage or is capable of producing. Being a practicing architect myself, is knowing what it takes to get 4 square walls up and keeping the rain out, and trying to convince people to let you do that. Lautner has this unique ability to continually put up structures that somehow push the limits.
I think the difference between John Lautner's work and the work of other architects who are interested in this indoor-outdoor relationship is that Lautner's buildings are more like landscapes in themselves. They're more like a series of hills or ocean waves. They define space differently. They don't box in space so much as they kind of cut space or give you some degree of shelter while still allowing you to participate in the landscape.
Do real architecture, you're creating a whole environment that's desirable to live in or work in. The shelter incorporates all of your emotional as well as physical needs.
You feel, in a sense, as if you're rejecting the artificial Western tradition of architecture and returning to the source.
Right. The Arabian tent, they had hanging carpets for partitions, so they had movable partitions 3,000 years before some company started making them here. You know, that's not a new thing. They made the partitions into fancy facades. Then the architecture started to deteriorate into styles and facades.
This notion of returning to primitive forms, of creating the mythic object by rejecting, in a sense, historical traditions in favor of the return to origins, is not a new concept, in a sense, although it is handled in a different way by Lautner. But you can go back to the first text on architecture, Vitruvius, and he talks about the primitive hut as the model for the temple.
The Lautner style is hardly individual. It draws its inspiration from a number of sources common to his time. He is a true modernist in the uncluttered way his buildings honestly express their structure.
I was born and brought up in the woods and lakes in northern Michigan, and my father was a professor and my mother was a painter, and I helped my father build a cabin on Lake Superior when I was 12 years old. So I got interested in building really when I was 12 years old. I took all kinds of subjects in college. I took physics, chemistry, astronomy, philosophy. I got a real liberal arts. And in the whole process of the 4 years, I was thinking of different professions, and it seemed to me that most of them ended up in a kind of a routine rut, that they did the same thing over and over, and they became boring. So I finally discovered Frank Lloyd Wright starting the apprentice training for architects. I took drafting when I was in high school, and I couldn't keep the pencil sharp. I couldn't make a neat drawing, and I knew the typical school, all they do is grade on neat, and then the hell with the ideas. And Mr. Wright had ideas, so I went for that. He did create a real apprentice training for architects, which is not just drafting, it's building. He believed in it, which they do to a great extent in Europe, to learn how to build. They do stonework and carpentry and plumbing and everything. Well, here, an architect can graduate from architectural school and he can't even hold a hammer. Sunday nights we had guests, like 30, 40 guests from Chicago or someplace, and string quartet and so forth. And apprentices would be in charge of the whole dinner. We cook and serve and clean up for 50 people. So when I design a kitchen, I know what goes on. Mr. Wright loved the total seasons that we had in Wisconsin. He had a previous client, Chandler, in Arizona. Chandler donated the living facilities, and at the same time Mr. Wright was working on Broadacre City, so it was ideal working condition for us to go to Arizona in the winter and work on these models out in the sunshine instead of freezing our fingers, you know. We did that for several years before Mr. Wright found this desert property and then started building a desert camp. In the construction of the camp, the first building was the vault to contain the drawings, and then the drafting room. Mr. Wright allowed some of the apprentices to build their own little camps, which is my first architectural design. Wes Peters, who is the chief architect now, and several other men went up to the mountains. They backed a truck up to the mountains and rolled the stones down on the flatbed, haul them in, and then other fellows would mix the cement and pick the stone and hold it in the form while they poured the concrete. And we'd do that for 8 or 10 hours a day, and we felt very healthy. That was really fun and exciting, real work. That's a lot better than drafting. When I initially went to Taliesin to study architecture, I wanted to do it from my own philosophical ideal basis. And I learned more about the ideals and principles and everything, of course, from Frank Lloyd Wright. After seeing the work of a genius, you have no idea whether you can do anything yourself. I decided that this was the time to leave Taliesin and try to get going on my own, even though it was depression. It was very difficult to leave such an ideal life. Then I came to Los Angeles, and I drove down Santa Monica Boulevard. It was so damn ugly it made me physically sick. Mr. Wright had this client, Sturgis, and designed this house. He said I could come and superintend the building. I did all the work and got all the permits and arranged all the contracts and so forth. It was a very difficult time for anything and almost impossible for architecture, but I had no money. I borrowed a lot from a friend of mine who was at Taliesin, and I borrowed on the lot to build a house, and I built my own first house. I believed in doing what you say. I just worked the way Mr. Wright worked, by example. I used to drive Frank Lloyd Wright when he came from Arizona to Los Angeles. He saw that house and approved it. I worked for a contractor during the war. I wanted to know everything there that could be known about actually doing the contracting, because you had to know that in order to do anything. And if I hadn't done that, when the contractor comes in and says, you can't do this, you can't do that, and it's going to cost $1 million extra, they succumb. Well, I tell them to get the hell out, because I know it can be done and I know how much it costs, and I can do it myself. So that's very important.
The name of John Lautner is not generally known in the mass public, but the influence of his works is felt and known throughout the popular culture. In the 1950s, a style of coffee shop architecture developed here in Southern California, spread nationwide. And the main influence for that style was John Lautner's work. Googie's, Henry's, others of his drive-ins in the late 1940s and 1950s became the prototypes for the California coffee shop.
I did a coffee dance downtown on Broadway. I did one on Vine Street. It was the first time they were really made into human environments for simple fast food kind of things. And then I had another client who did Henry's. I did a whole chain for him, and they're all extinct now.
Very unusual. It's one of the first places that was designed for the view. First, the near view, which was people walking from Schwab, all the movie crowd, and so on. Also, you could see in the distance the hills, the Hollywood Hills, right up Laurel Canyon. So it's one of the first places that was designed for traffic.
So with that steel frame and steel decking, it was the fastest, cheapest building you could get, but I made it into something suitable for people inside so they could look out to the mountains instead of looking into the garbage. And they, by turning up the roof, I had an integral signboard. While most restaurants and buildings would have a box and then they have a billboard stuck on top, so nobody ever understood it. But they made a lot of chatter about it.
The original Lautner buildings, Googie's in particular on Sunset Strip, was so powerful, so strong, so striking, that it gave the name to a whole style of architecture. These California coffee shops came to be known as the Googie style. A number of his buildings have been used in several movies, and it leads to an interesting speculation about the appeal of this architecture. It has a lushness, a luxuriousness, and an American modern style which serves well for mass audience entertainment.
Hi there. I'm Bambi.
Good morning, Bambi.
And I'm Thumper. Is there something we can do?
I can think of several things offhand, but at the moment I'm looking for Willard White.
Oh, Willie. Why, he's right out there.
And that's all there is to it.
Not quite. First, we're gonna have a ball. All yours, Bambi.
John Lautner is making houses that push the boundaries of what you can do with concrete and steel to make objects that are as unique, as exciting as possible. And therefore, of course, they're also the most exciting place to set a movie, an action movie, a thriller movie, a suspense movie, because these buildings are inherently thrilling and exciting just in their physical expression of space, of the building as an object. These buildings are presented as characters of personality in themselves. The John Lautner houses are about completely different issues than normal houses are. Normal houses are about providing the standard spaces, the bedroom, the living room. The John Lautner houses are about experience. They're about space. They're one of a kind. They are unique objects.
Thank you. Sam, here's to... Wait. Do this right. Come here. Hollywood. To Hollywood. Oh, I had a hell of a time. I've had a hell of a time all my life. It's very disappointing to me, particularly when I don't get any public work or any commercial work. What we have now are committees, committee architects, and how the hell you can do anything with a committee is insane. It's compromise. I find that I get 6 or 8 a year out of 10 million with guts enough or interest enough to do something individual in architecture who refuse to be dictated to by the banker or the builder or the real estate agent as a piece of merchandise. I feel frustrated a lot of times because I just say, well, what the hell is the use of writing about it or talking about it? You have to go and look at it, and if you can't see it when you're looking at it, you never will. I mean, I do compare it sometimes like the old thing. If you don't know what jazz is, you never will. I mean, you can't define it, you can't catalog it. If you don't recognize it, that's too bad, that's all. When I first visited the site, I got the idea to build a large open terrace so that all you have is the beauty of the Acapulco Bay, the sky, and the mountains. You don't feel you're in a building at all. You're out in space with the beauty of nature.
It is fact that you see in the process of John Lautner, it's a fact of making thoughts, of denying the thoughts. That is the organic point, because the breadth of the thoughts is an intellectual operation. But the moment in which you don't break anymore the box, because the box is no more there, right? Organic architecture starts at the moment in which the box is not there anymore. And before you create that free came born a hero.
I've only been in John's office once, but it is not the standard by which the West Coast exists. I mean, it's the antithesis of showmanship.
I saw all the toss-away stuff, all the ideas that weren't used, which were, many times as good or better than what was built. He would just, do sketch after sketch after sketch, whether it was like for a scheme for a garden or a cantilever, a deck of a house, or even some small section of it would be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 ideas or more. And it was for every facet of the house, everything that he did. It wasn't just 1 or 2. I mean, he could do them infinitely. He could just have kept going on with the same part of the house and kept coming up with idea after idea and never stopped.
This is a great example of what you don't have to be a good architect. John challenges you. He's always forcing you. He's just so focused on what he does. If anything that he's taught Angela and I, it's the importance of reading people. And he knows that if he can get you to understand what he's about to do, that the resistance to money goes away.
John is always, quote unquote, the master. He'll give you a sketch, whether it's on a napkin or whatever. Just a real rough thumbnail sketch, and his sketches are they're really incredible because they're really rough. They're almost childlike. Every line or mark is there for a reason, and it's to scale. Even though they're rough, they communicate his ideas. He'll give you this sketch, and then you're expected to turn it into a set of working drawings. Like he'll take it through a certain design point, and then he'll check it and revise it. And there's a lot of working back and forth. He's very open to new ideas if you've explored them and worked them through. I mean, there's nothing worse than going in there without being prepared.
You felt free while you were there in the office. He was activating all the energy that was there. He was not fighting your ideas. He let you go. That's a fantastic quality. To make you feel free and at the same time to guide you. The first time I saw him drawing, I thought, look at this carpenter. I mean, he was drawing like a carpenter. He was building while he was drawing. He doesn't give to the drawing any importance. When the project is in your mind, then it's not important if you draw it well or not, as long as you know what you want.
John is actually the most terrible draftsman I ever saw in my life. He's rather proud of it. When he was at Taliesin, he scorned the idea of perfect draftsmanship or even not a really good draftsmanship. John used to take a very soft pencil like anywhere from an HB to a 2B and would hold it in his hand like this. And I've seen him draw like that, laying the T-square along or triangle along thing and draw a line like that. And he's always, not only naturally, but he's even developed a scorn of fancy draftsmanship because he always felt that wasn't the main essence.
John has taken free form in many cases and developed entirely new interior space with free form. And he arrives at a true structural concept, and I think that's the same way that Frank Lloyd Wright worked. I mean, I don't think that, although Mr. Wright has studied engineering to a certain extent,
his really great thing was a sense of structure.
I think I've developed that over the years, is a real sense of valid structure, to the degree that when I do a whole new scheme and I give it to the engineer that I'm working with, he agrees that it's a sound concept, even if it's radical. If you want to create a new idea and build it, you just have one continuous fight against the status quo. The only way I've been able to get anything done is I've had clients who agreed, and we fight the contractors and we fight the bankers and we fight everybody, and we finally get it done. The basic idea for this house, which I arrived at actually the next day after being up on the hill here with him, I thought of this idea of saving the hilltop. So this arch over leaves it open through to the mountains and the sea, and leaves the hilltop completely free. So it's a private glassed-in original hilltop. In designing a building or solving an architectural problem, the major element is the interior space that you create, which is first of all a human space, a free space. From that derives the structure and the detail and the whole thing. There's very little drawing, there's a lot of thinking. I get the basic facts of what's existing or to exist, and then I beat my brains out about how to do whatever is necessary for the whole project. Sometimes I sit for hours before I draw anything, and sometimes I don't get it till 2 or 3 days later.
Silvertop was a home, basically. It started out as a home, and it was an experimental home, but a lot of questions arose, such as when would it ever be complete? What kind of problems would evolve in the construction of it? There were new ideas being produced all the time, partly because I'm an inventor, and partly because John was receptive to experimentation, probably stimulated by some of his thinking about what was needed in architecture.
He got interested in the architecture so much that we had meetings about how to do everything, so we designed everything right from scratch and made it right from scratch. So there isn't a stock item in this whole house.
constructed and the city wouldn't give us a permit on it. We decided to fight the city. We demanded that they give us a permit, and they said we're not going to have a permit. And so, to my attorneys, we wrote legal action against the city and demanded that they make in a load test, see if the load test would prove it to be structurally sound. And the test was made and it was proved eminently safe, and they gave a permit and so on.
We not only had a problem with the driveway, almost every idea I ever had, some technical aspect of it, did not technically fit the code. Actually, we got something like 40 permits before we were through. It wasn't just the driveway, it was 40 deviations from the code. And I've had that all my life. Arthur Elrod, being an interior designer, knew much more than most people about houses, but he wanted something more. When he came to me, he had seen some of my work. He said, "Give me what you think I should have on that property." The typical client would be much more fussy, finicky, and not understanding the whole idea, but he was looking for architecture. I had this whole lot excavated another 8 feet to expose the rock outcrops so that we could make a design that was integrated with the desert. And the first design I made and model, he loved and went ahead and did it. By doing it this way, it's almost like a desert flower, and these clear stories go around so you get a different sunlight as the sun moves around. It fits right into the desert. This is an example of improving life and suiting the situation. But what I tell students, after 30 or 40 years of good work, you begin to get a decent client who trusts you, and then you're free to really contribute, and you have total responsibility. My clients are all pretty strong individuals, or they wouldn't come at all. They're just individuals who happen to discover some values of architecture, and they discover that they like things that I've done, that there's feeling and there's character, and they recognize it. It doesn't matter what the budget is. If somebody's interested in architecture, I could do it. I could do a beautiful job with drywall, but I wouldn't do it because it's phony. It's cardboard. All I want to know is their basic physical requirements, whatever it is, so that I can create the biggest and best kind of spaces. And then any idiosyncrasies or likes, dislikes in environment or material, and then I have a clue to something that will specifically suit that situation. And that can all be done in about 10 minutes.
The house was like a healing instrument. When I come into the house, it was fantastic. He was like taking 100 aspirins every night. It was like just completely mellowing and nurturing. And it was because of the organic nature of the house. It's like living outside, because it's all glass and redwood and brick. It is wedged into the hillside. So about a third of the house is cantilevered out. But when you live in it, it's like you're outside all the time. It's like you're never inside. And yet, you know, when it's raining and cold outside, it's warm inside. If it's very hot outside, it's cool inside. But you always feel like you're outside, because wherever you look, you don't ever see a wall.
It's kind of like an intimate, elegant cocoon. And the quality of openness and light, at the same time feeling totally private. And it's a very inside-outside life. Just the energy here is so different. It really impacts people like they just landed off a jet in Hawaii. Just feels wonderful to live in it.
The wind was one of the major factors, because I stayed in a motel in Palm Springs when I first came down here, and it rattled so much I couldn't sleep. So I decided it had to be something that didn't rattle, for one thing. And then as a repeating space for a motel, I had to devise something so you're not just open on the ends or boxed into an air-conditioned box. So by having the sloping concrete roofs in clear story, everyone sees the sky and has an interior garden, and the other side has a skylit wall. This is one of a group that I did just after the war with prefabricated system for erecting a roof first. And then I thought, great idea, because you can get a roof prefabricated and erected on a subcontract, and all you have to do is fill in between the roof and the floor, and you got a house, however much you can afford to close in. And if you can't, you have a future area that you can close in, and you end up with a total entity. I mean, it was impossible to build during the war, and it was impossible to build after the war, and of course, as far as that goes, it's impossible to build right now. But he built it himself with several doctor friends and 2 or 3 good carpenters on weekends, total in 6 months. And nowadays, you know, they talk about high tech, it would be 2 years before they get it done.
John says, well, you know, after all, every house that you do is a problem. You have to solve a problem, which is how people can live in a house and still have the house be something that will grow and live with them and not confine them.
The quality of this house, as to compare it to a normal Beverly Hills house, is so different. And it's different in many ways that you have to get used to. We now are John Lautner advocates. We think he's the greatest. I thought he was when we first saw that house, and I fell in love with it as Joan did. But after a while, we felt that maybe he didn't understand how people live in houses. And we've now come to the conclusion that he did, and that it was our problem, not his.
So far, we haven't had any new space to the house. We've only been upgrading everything that was there before, trying to bring in the latest in technology, many things that weren't possible back in 1962 when the house was so
experiments on it, trial and error to achieve what we finally achieved on it.
And the original idea of the whole living room was to get a perforated light like you get in a primeval forest. But I've been in one in northern Michigan where there's still a few primeval forests, and that light is just magnificent. There are 750 old-fashioned glasses in that roof, and the owners cemented them in themselves.
I said, I'd like to have a window above the sink instead of a wall so that I can see the view while I'm standing at the sink. So then John took it one step further. He said, well, how about if we have a glass sink? Because I've always wanted to do a glass sink. And so I said, sure, that sounds great. So that's sort of typical of the way the two of us work together. He throws out his ideas, I throw out mine, and I feel as though I'm participating with him in the design of every little detail that goes on, and I enjoy doing that. It's really a very creative thing for me.
I can't begin to tell you how many evenings I sit in the living room looking at the different lines and curves and angles of the house, working together like a complex piece of sculpture. Often we shift from one chair to another just to get perspectives and to point out to each other various details that are more accentuated from one time to another due to lighting changes, the sky, glass reflections. You get so much pleasure from this house that the more you are in it, become a part of it, the more beautiful it becomes.
As far as the Stevens house is concerned, the client wanted 5 bedrooms, baths, a swimming pool, and so on, which normally wouldn't even fit on that piece of land, a little 30-foot wide lot. Typically, you get a box with windows on each end. It's a great solution for townhouses. The row house, townhouse, has been a problem all over the world, and it's never really been well solved. But this one, it opens up and frees people instead of closing them in.
In the Bob house, Mr. and Mrs. Hope were interested, they said initially, in not a large house, but they didn't want to entertain, in fact, even for presidents.
From Bob Hope's home in Palm Springs, we bring you Bob Hope's Yellow Ribbon Party.
My basic scheme, which they liked immediately, was to make a smaller private house on the second level in a large open area with guest rooms and so forth on the ground level for entertainment.
Tell the kitchen it's an emergency, will you?
I just saw on TV the yellow ribbon ceremony, and you could see at least 500 people sitting down for dinner, so the entertainment house really works beautifully. When I first showed it to Bob, the model, for final approval at his Toluca Lake house, it was on the billiard table, and he walked around and around looking at it, and finally he said, well, at least when they come down from Mars, they'll know where to go.
square inch. So we've been doing final things and checking things and all continuously during the whole construction process. When he came to me, he said, I've been a Clydesdale, you know, a workhorse, 12 hours a day for my whole life. I want a whole new world in an 8-car garage. The model here shows the whole property on the Pacific. I have a total concept, and then I make a rough cardboard model. I use models instead of renderings because renderings are misleading and people don't understand what they are, but with a model you know what you're getting. Actually, we got going on the working drawings through photographing the model and ultimately defined it for construction. None of these are radius curves. The whole thing is free. And these free curves are very subtle kinds of things to design and even more to define in working drawings for construction.
This process is continuous, so the best project is always going to be the next one.
By having a structure where the ceiling is curving up and out, it just reflects the landscape or the sky, and the bathrooms are sunk half level down with gardens on top, and the storage is in the attic, so there are no walls. This will be the panorama. And then you come down here to a garden motor court, and then the pool is on the edge, so when you're in there, you just look over water to space. When you get a solution that's even better than you expect yourself, that keeps you alive. I guess I just love architecture, that I really devoted my life to it. I'm completely involved with it to such an extent that 50 years has gone by and I feel like it was about 5 or 10 years, and I don't know what the hell happened to 40 years because I was involved.
So Betty has agreed to field some questions. And it's rare that we have a filmmaker with us, so now's your chance to ask any film-related questions that you have. I guess my first one, I have a question. Forget you. I'm interested in the difference. Could you characterize the difference between filming, let's say, narrative action and characters, actors, in a kind of Hollywood sense, versus filming spaces and surfaces in architecture? How would you describe that difference?
Well, I'll call John Lautner my actor, and he's like any other actor that I'd be filming. As far as filming, my thing is I love building, I love space, and I love to see structure. And I was able to find cinematographers that also were enchanted by the structures and enchanted about the idea of filming space. I got a lot of other cinematographers that were quite happy and excited to interview John Lautner. Because I didn't have a lot of funding for this film, and so people really volunteered their services, and whenever I could, get enough money to do another shoot, I just got a crew together and we were able to document what we could. And we did it in about 3 years, which is rather quick for a documentary, but we did it in John Lautner's lifetime.
What questions do you guys have?
What was Lautner's reaction to Hollywood's interest in his work? I mean, did he give it a lot of consideration, or was it kind of just, I guess I'm wondering, did he enjoy the interest? Or?
He did. He was really interested in designing real buildings, but for him, it's like well, they were building the Rainbow House on the lot. He got a kick out of it, but he didn't take it very seriously. He liked the attention, but I think he really wanted to build a big structure, like he really would have loved to have built a museum or something, and he never got that opportunity. But he got a kick out of the Hollywood thing. But just it was a kick, and he liked the attention.
I mean, just to put that in perspective, the cinematographer for Lethal Weapon 2 pointed out that the original house Lautner designed cost something like $50,000 all told. But the mock-up, the full-size mock-up they built, cost $500,000.
That's not a model. It's not a scale model.
It's a full-size house. $500,000 to build and $500,000 to destroy. So just to give you some idea.
Now I'll update that because the current owners of that house have totally restored it with marble and Ratzinger. And I'm sure that cost a fortune. I don't know how, but it's been totally restored, every bit of it. They recognize the need to do that.
And that brings up a question in my mind about so many of his sites are so precarious. So many of the sites are so precarious. In the last house, is that the Turner house? The last one on Malibu?
The future site, the unbuilt
No,
site?
no, I'm sorry. The one
That's the Levy house.
The Levy house. But at any rate, a lot of them are on very precarious sites. Have they fared all right in the recent past?
Absolutely
No
amazing.
mudslides or...
No, I think in an earthquake, one, like the Silvertop house lost some glass, and that's it. Structurally, it's that is it, and that's pretty amazing, because being in earthquake country. I think that there's probably basic restoration things like with everything else, but I think he really had the structure down.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the chemosphere, one contact point in an earthquake is a lot better than 4, for example. And the Silvertop house, that kind of curved, pre-stressed concrete roof actually bounced. And it was the bounce that put the glass in compression and shattered it. Because the glass is actually hung, so it's in tension. So anyway, he always had a kind of, interesting structural gimmick that was a real part of it. Yeah, Lori.
I'm curious about your process, research that went into thinking about ways that you were going to film these spaces. And did you go many times before to kind of analyze the house in terms of how you thought about filming it? I mean, what was your process like?
The biggest deal, even today, is accessing these structures and getting permission. So several of the owners wouldn't give me permission. So, like the Malibu house, the concrete castle, they didn't give me permission to shoot in there. I was invited while they were building it, and I photographed, so some of those stills were from that. So I didn't get that opportunity, but I got the opportunity to shoot it with a helicopter. And so that, I was fortunate in that. The Acapulco house. With that house, again, with access, because I had been to Acapulco, just dying to get up there, but couldn't access it. Well, once I finally accessed it, I went up with the whole crew. So we had like 3 cinematographers, some assistants, and we had 3 days. And so it was a matter of just filming the space and moving with it, and doing that. So every house was pretty much different, but it's access. And now it's even harder and harder to access these houses, like the Chemisphere, that one is totally shut up. Tasha won't allow people in there. I don't know if you guys know, but the current TV is built a set of the Chemisphere, and so they do all the interviews on the interior of the set, and they've chosen Lautner. So it's, again, the sort of cinematic aspects. That's Al Gore's TV station. So which other house, I guess? It's the cinematographers that I talk into going with me to do these things. Like when I went to the Elrod house and I got John Lautner, I don't know how we got it, but we didn't have a real dolly, but we had like a shopping cart. And what was the shopping cart doing? I don't even remember, but that's how, I don't remember going to get it, but that's how we got those movie shots. And again, it was shooting late at night and early in the morning, and then the passage of time. And I think that time lapse really helps you get a feeling of the space.
Just wondering about the relationship with the distortion of the lenses that you choose, and about the depiction of the space, and whether there's a kind of internal dialogue about distortion versus reality, or how does that play a role when you're producing?
Well, with this one, every house, every shoot, because pretty much it would be, I would shoot in bits, like I did like the Acapulco thing. So, and since it was like we had Steadicam guy, but it was 2 cinematographers, and the deal with these guys was I got the film equipment that they wanted, and I got the film stuff that they wanted. So they chose the lenses, I chose the shots, and they chose which lenses. So they were the real cinematographers, but we planned out the movements. And then the Steadicam operator, he just moved around, and I guess he worked with the cinematographers. So that's how that worked. So mostly every cinematographer told me what they wanted me to get. And sometimes I could get camera packages donated. We would shoot weekends, so you would pay for 1 day, but you would actually shoot 3. That's how that worked with film. And now, I guess, for rental videos, but I think you still can do the weekend packages.
Yeah, how does or you say recently you use digital film and do everything with the computer? How does it feel to you as a filmmaker? The actual act of cutting the film versus doing stuff on the computer. Has it influenced the way you actually make your films at all?
Well, it's kind of exciting that you could do things so fast and think about things so fast, but I personally miss, touching film. It's like, even when we were running it, I wanted to touch it to see if there's any broken sprocket holes. I swear, I was like, so I missed that, touching, and that's my thing. That's what how I learned how to edit was doing that. So, but I think it's amazing. It's digital technology, but I miss the
yeah.
When you were filming, Lautner seemed to be at some of the sites. Did that affect how you decided to depict the space in any way? I mean, did his visions or opinions of his own buildings affect the way you saw, or?
Well, it helped us because we had him on site, so we could ask him questions about the building. And so in that, it didn't have anything to do with the way we shot his space, with the way we interpreted his space. But it was just great to be able to access him, to ask him about the buildings. And so I have like this huge archive of John just talking, going on, which John has read a lot of it. And just to have him be accessible like that, and to really be inside of his process, and to allow us to get inside there.
Yeah.
I noticed a lot of the houses you began the filming with this cinematography focusing on sort of natural element of boulder, water, the landscape. Was that your intention to show that how that was integrated into the houses?
Well, you know, every one of John's buildings are site-specific, and so I think that the environment has such a big deal, and maybe it's just that the mystery of revealing the space. It wasn't really an intentional thing, other than just get that, you know, contrast. But they are all mostly all in really interesting sites. Even his own house, you know, the first one that he built for himself, it's very close to the Silvertop house, but it has a beautiful view, and the house makes the best use out of that view. I think he's a real master in being able to do that.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, I mean, the view isn't there until the house is. Even though these are dramatic sites, he's very much constructing these views, because until they're framed, until they're condensed and baffled and orchestrated, you know, that the view is not any different than the house next door, you know, for example. So there's something about the breadth and the compression of what he was doing that was creating the magnificent view. So, for example, he would never face, let's say, the primary view perpendicular to the ocean, for example. So he's already producing a kind of shift, and you know what one of the historians described as a cupping of space is really creating kind of an oblique perspective that already that simple move animates the view in a different way than a straight kind of frontal, what he would call kind of boxed-in motel view would provide. So there's a real orchestration at play here, and I think it's important to think about, because architects often just attribute the drama of the spaces to their location. Well, anyone could do that up on the hill, but I'm here to tell you, you know, every house in Hollywood is up on the hill, and you know they're not that dramatic. So something important to think about. Also, I want to emphasize, you know, this notion of distortion. Your question about distortion, because these projects are already distorted. You know, he's purposely kind of breaking the box. So he's already working with distortion. So the camera lenses, you know, that Betty's using to further distort is an important move. You know, it evinces that, you know, the kind of architectural distortions that we all produce every day and never really think about as readily or clearly as we might. So that's what I was talking about with the framing of the framing, working incredibly well in the film, I think. What else? What other? They don't have to be Lautner-specific questions either. And I think most of our students are interested in film in one way or another. And so, any technical? Yeah.
Sometimes you use still photographs instead of video, and you can inside the photograph. And I'm wondering how you chose between animal or inside the.
Well, like how I move it inside.
You have a photograph and you move.
I think just to make it interesting, to move in, you know, into a shot rather than just have a static shot.
I mean, how did you choose between using a photograph and an actual video?
Some of the photographs were archival, and so I used archival photographs, but we filmed the photographs, and so we actually did camera moves into the pictures. That's what we did. Rather than do it on the computer, because you can do those computer moves now, and you know, and it kind of simulates a camera, but I actually had real cameramen. Like at Taliesin, we got those archival photographs from the 30s, but we just shot outside with sunlight and a 16mm camera and did our moves right there. So, but now pretty much people do it on the computer and, you know, do those moves that way. but I like the fluidity of it when we did it that way. I think it makes a difference.
Any final question? One in the back.
Yeah, a question about just the soundtrack of the film. Just kind of comment on what your specific intentions were, how that would make the whole film read based on the soundtrack.
I'll just talk to you about how I did it. I didn't have one composer. The way I worked with the sound was the way I worked pretty much with the cinematographers. I gave different composers different sections of the film and let them do their interpretations. So, I mean, I think that's how I was able to work with a lot of really creative people. Some cinematographers I never met even. I just sent them the sequences and they did it. Like Peter Buffett, he just did a section, and I just broke it up and gave them sections, and they did it. That's how that worked. So what I like to do is give people, tell them what I want, and give them like creative freedom, and then get the best out of people.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. See you on Friday.
Oh, good. We're perfect at the time.